Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Across the world, it seems, the far right is on the rise.
The far-right National Rally Party emerged from Sunday's first round in a comfortable first place, with just over 33% of the vote.
France is heading into the second round of its election this weekend and is the latest country to see a growth in support for hardline conservative political parties. Meanwhile, of course, the United States has an authoritarian criminal currently polling ahead of the Democratic incumbent. But then there is the United Kingdom, which goes to the polls today to, apparently, flush a longtime conservative majority down the drain.
Polling from our partners at the BBC show the Labour Party is on track to win the largest share of parliamentary seats in the upcoming July 4th election. Prime Minister Sunak's own Conservative Party is polling at 21%. Some estimates have the Tories winning as few as 72 seats compared to the 365 seats they won in 2019's general election.
So why do these two G7 powers seem poised to go in opposite political directions during the same week? Is this really the rise of the far right? Or is it just that voters everywhere, from France to the UK and the US, and certainly here in Canada, are sick of the status quo and just want to vote the bums out, no matter which side of the aisle those bums sit on? Will the balance of power in Europe and the G7 shift this week? And what might that tell us about the future of global politics? I'm Jordan Heath-Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Josh Keating is a senior correspondent at Vox, where he covers foreign policy and world affairs. Hey, Josh.
Hi, happy to be here.
Thanks for joining us. And right off the top, I got to ask you, the United Kingdom goes to the polls today to do what, according to basically every expert out there?
Well, really what we expect to happen today is an end to 14 years of rule by the Conservative Party. It would be a kind of shock of world historic proportions if that didn't happen. The polls suggest that the opposition Labour Party will win around 430 seats in the 650-seat parliament, which would be basically their biggest majority of the post-war era. It'd be bigger than in 1997 when Tony Blair won. And the Conservatives are projected to fall from about 344 seats to just 109, which would be a massive turnaround for them. And there are constituencies that have been loyal Tory bastions. They're now in play. And Prime Minister Rishi Sunak will almost certainly have to leave 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister after today. He may even lose his own seat, and he would be the first Prime Minister that would ever have happened to.
Okay, so 14 years of Conservatives in power, and now they face a pretty big wipeout. What happened here?
I mean, some of it's, as we say in the U.S., the economy's stupid. Growth is slow, inflation is high. Had their largest increase in the poverty rate in 30 years. There are shortages and delays in the National Health Service. A housing shortage caused by the underinvestment in construction. So there's all of those factors. But I think a certain amount of it is just a level of chaos that voters are tired of. In those 14 years, there have been 5 different prime ministers, 3 of those just in the last few years. And there have been a series of scandals. And for an American, it reminds me a little bit of the 2020 election, where it's not so much that voters were so inspired by Joe Biden and the Democrats. I don't think Britons are particularly inspired by Keir Starmer and Labour, but it's just a sort of a vote to restore stability after, several years of seeming chaos.
And the other thing I wanted to ask you about, because I know all the things you listed, all the issues around the economy are familiar to American listeners, also to our Canadian listeners. But is any of this about Brexit, which had been, I guess, the Conservatives' singular policy push and achievement over the past decade or so?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that defenders of this government will point to, the sort of external shocks that the country had to deal with. The COVID pandemic, of course, the economic impact of the war in Ukraine on prices. But all governments had to deal with those factors. But the only country in the world that had Brexit was the United Kingdom. And that was very much the sort of signature policy of this period of conservative rule, and the one that's really overwhelmingly dominated British politics since 2015, when David Cameron was elected, promising to hold a referendum on British membership in the European Union. And I think that there's an emerging consensus that Brexit was a failure. I mean, Britain's GDP is only about 1.7% higher than it was pre-pandemic, compared to 3.7% for the Eurozone, 8.7% for the United States. And, studies have attributed a lot of the impact of that to the impact of Brexit. And one big driver of the vote on Brexit was concerns about immigration. People wanted less immigration, but actually migration to Britain has increased since Brexit. So it's this sort of weird effect where, the economic drivers of migration to the UK didn't go away. They still needed people to staff their stores. They still needed nurses for the National Health Service. So what you've had is more immigration from outside the EU and more people who had been sort of temporary workers traveling back and forth between the UK and countries in Europe have just stayed because it's harder to travel back and forth now. So it's not really surprising when you look at the polls and see that about 60% of British voters, including more than a third of the Leave voters, the people who voted for Brexit, now say that it was more of a failure than a success.
So might a Labour government, particularly a massive majority, like you mentioned, consider reversing the decision, holding a referendum to reverse the decision? Like, where does this changing government, assuming it happens, leave Brexit?
Well, the short answer is no. The Labour government that's likely coming in has said that they will not try to rejoin the European Union. I mean, frankly, it just wouldn't be practical at this point. Joining the EU is sort of a difficult and complex process for any country. And I don't think the European Union is particularly inclined to make it easy for the British after the experience of the last few years. What they have said is they're going to renegotiate their relationship with Brexit to sort of remove some of the trade barriers that British businesses have to deal with, to make movement back and forth easier, particularly for students, and to sort of soften some of the impact that Brexit has had on the British economy, and also sort of deepen sort of defense and political ties with European countries, particularly sort of in response to the war in Ukraine. But, I don't think that we're actually going to see any move towards formally rejoining the EU, no matter what happens today.
So what will Keir Starmer's priorities be and the Labour government's priorities be then? There's obviously a wide swath of dissatisfaction out there. Do we know what they plan to tackle, or is it just sort of a generic center-left government?
Yeah, I mean, some sort of more progressive allies or supporters of Labour have accused Starmer of sort of just wanting to stumble into 10 Downing Street by, not rocking the boat, not making any big pledges. I mean, priorities have been sort of reducing wait times and, openings for patients in the National Health Service, increasing funding to public schools by raising taxes on private schools. So Britain has had sort of several of these landslide elections. If you think about sort of Margaret Thatcher coming in 1979, or Tony Blair and sort of New Labour coming in 97, or even David Cameron, who was, promising a sort of very different kind of Labour Party, sort of more socially progressive. This isn't that kind of election. We're not hearing of sort of big philosophical difference. And on the foreign policy front, I don't think we're going to see huge changes. Support for Ukraine, for instance, is sort of a matter of bipartisan consensus in the UK. In terms of the war in Gaza, I think some Muslim voters in Britain and sort of people more on the left in the UK have accused, Starmer of being a little timid, being slow to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. So I think, we shouldn't anticipate any big swings there. Again, to make the comparison to Joe Biden in 2020, I think that there's going to be an emphasis on sort of showing that Britain is back. I think that the Brexit years kind of created the sense that this island nation was becoming more isolationist, sort of removing itself from European affairs. And I think that a challenge for Starmer is to sort of demonstrate that, Britain can once again, play a prominent role in global affairs, be a big player in multilateral organizations. And I think that he's going to have his work cut out for him there.
So the reason we wanted to talk to you now beyond this potential blowout is because the UK is not the only G7 country that could see a new government this weekend. What is also on schedule just a couple of days from now in France, and what are the stakes there?
Yeah, so this is a sort of fascinating turnabout we've seen in French politics. It was back on June 26th after the far-right National Rally Party won a huge victory in European Parliament elections. French President Emmanuel Macron called parliamentary elections in France, called them early. And I think he did this thinking that it would sort of show that this was a fluke, that when the French were voting for their own election rather than in European elections that can kind of have fluky results, that it would show that this support for the far right wasn't actually that strong. And it really backfired on him. On the first round of voting on June 30th, the National Rally, which is the far-right party, which is led by Marine Le Pen, won about 33% of the vote, coming in first place. A coalition of left-wing parties, the National Popular Front came in second with about 28%, and his own centrist, Ensemble party fell to third place, winning only about 20%. The other thing that was remarkable about that first round of voting is it was a very high turnout, about 60%.
Can you explain what exactly will happen in this second round of voting? I don't think Canadian listeners, or at least many of them, are familiar with going back to the polls a week or two after voting for the first time. And does this mean that the far right will form government or not? Like, how does this work?
Yeah, French parliamentary elections are notoriously complicated. So basically, because of that high turnout, in many districts in the country, more than two candidates qualified for the runoff. So you had 3 or even 4 candidate runoffs. But what's happened just, in the last 48 hours is more than 200 third place candidates from the left and center parties have dropped out, basically in order to form a kind of cordon sanitaire to block the far right from power. And there's a sort of tradition of this in French politics, parties uniting across ideological barriers to block the far right from power. And so basically, there's kind of 2 scenarios that can happen. In the first one, if the far right wins 289 seats out of 577 in parliament, they will have an absolute majority. They could have an absolute majority. There's also a scenario where they could sort of come close to that and get some more support. But basically, in one scenario, they will control parliament. Jordan Bardella, the sort of 28-year-old wunderkind of the far right in France, will become prime minister, and they will have what's called a cohabitation government, where you'll have a prime minister from the far right, and Macron will stay on as president. That has happened a few times in French history, but it's a little rare. The other scenario that can happen is there'll be no party with an absolute majority and no sort of logical coalition. And there'll basically be a hung parliament, which will basically kind of hamstring French domestic politics for a few years. From the point of view, if you're on the left or the center, that's sort of best case scenario right now.
Regardless of how the second round turns out, this is a repudiation, at least, of Macron, and in the UK, a repudiation of Sunak and the Tories in general. Where is this anti-incumbent sentiment coming from? Because it seems to be hitting politicians on the left and the right.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little strange to see France moving right and Britain moving left like this. But to some extent, I think we should resist over-narrativizing it. There's sort of very particular conditions in both these countries. But as you say, incumbents basically all over the Western democratic world are very unpopular right now. That's certainly the case here in the United States with President Biden. It's the case with Prime Minister Trudeau. I think there's a few factors. You could point to inflation as being something that, is never good news for incumbent leaders. I think there's the kind of lingering political after effects of the pandemic, which I think probably had a kind of radicalizing effect on politics that we're still just beginning to understand. The impact of social media on sort of polarization, a sort of increase in people moving to extremes. Everywhere we've seen a kind of like hollowing out of the traditional centrist parties. I mean, in France, the traditional center-left Socialist Party and the center-right party, which has currently called Les Républicains, but it's had like a ton of names in the last few years. It's hard to even keep track of. I mean, those are both basically shells of their former selves. And Macron was a beneficiary of that. His sort of centrist bloc helped to kind of destroy the long-running two-party system in France, and the far right is reaping the benefit. And I also think, if you look at sort of the rise of far-right parties, I think that, to some extent, particularly on immigration, you've seen center-right or centrist parties sort of adopt some of the far-right's framing of the issue. I think, the French government adopted a really draconian new immigration law last year that Le Pen, the leader of the far-right, described as an ideological victory for her party. This sort of rhetoric that they used to talk about Islam in the French government is sort of very familiar. Even Keir Starmer in the UK, like some of his immigration rhetoric has been the kind of stuff that a few years ago might not have been outside what you'd hear from right-wing parties. So I think that that's kind of like normalized a lot of the policies that we hear from the far right. And, the intention was maybe to take votes away from these extremist parties, but it, in some cases, maybe had the opposite effect. Voters look at this and say, well, if these mainstream parties are proposing policies that aren't that different from what the far right's saying, why don't I just vote for the real thing?
Ideology aside, what do you make of the future of politics in a world where, at least in all the elections we're talking about here, and I think particularly in whenever the next election is here in Canada, the vast majority of voters just seem to be voting against something and expressing displeasure and anger rather than attempting to build something new?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, a tough pill to swallow for those of us who are small L liberal, that the most popular leaders in the world right now, if you look at polls, are people like Narendra Modi in India, although he suffered a bit of a setback in his election last month, or Javier Milei in Argentina, who sort of self-described anarcho-capitalist who ran on a real like burn it all platform in Argentina, or the outgoing president López Obrador in Mexico. Real kind of people who sort of express a real kind of populist, illiberal vision. And I think that it's a real challenge for sort of traditional centrists, center-right, center-left parties to sort of articulate a vision, a sort of positive vision that can compete with that. And unfortunately, I'm not really seeing anybody doing it effectively right now. I mean, maybe the sort of relative success of the Congress Party in India in the parliamentary elections last month, even though they didn't win by any means, they sort of outperformed expectations and articulated a bit of an alternative. But there's definitely a kind of anti-incumbent, anti-centrist, anti-establishment, like burn it all down mood among voters right now. And that's a challenge if you're trying to do traditional mainstream politics.
Josh, thank you so much for this. It's really appreciated. I guess we see what happens this weekend.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
Josh Keating, senior correspondent at Vox. That was The Big Story. You can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca to find all of our episodes, more than 1,700, I believe, by now. And you can also, if you like, give us some feedback on any one of those episodes, especially this one, by writing an email to hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by calling us at 416-935-5935 and suggesting a topic or just ranting about this one. The Big Story is in all of your podcast players, and of course, it's on your smart speaker if you ask it to play the Big Story podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.